Hey, I'll present to you today cryptocurrencies and VAT fraud detection and cross-border payment systems, and we'll assess together the sustainability in the e-commerce industry and go even a bit beyond. So, legally speaking, there is a legal status of cryptocurrencies. So some countries do, by virtue of this legal status, ban cryptocurrencies. Others have only an implicit ban in place, and it's quite crucial to understand that there are also un cryptoed parts of society that don't have discriminatory legislation in place. And then the regulatory framework for cryptocurrencies can be determined by countries who are applying tax laws in an attempt to regulate cryptos, and others who have anti-money laundering and anti-terrorism financing laws in place. Only a few countries are combining those two strategies, even in the face of the overarching fear that crypto users are more prone to fraud and illegal activities. So the question here is if the jurisdiction in question has a classification of crypto assets in place. And this classification is also quite interesting if the country wants to, let's say, use cryptocurrencies as a mean of escaping debt rabbit holes that is steamed during the financial crisis, because cryptocurrencies are more prone to behave as, let's say, securities than cash, and therefore, especially Bitcoin is more comparable to something like a gold asset and or gold, and therefore engaging into debt sovereignty strategies in combination with Bitcoin or cryptos in general can add financial stability to the system. Furthermore, many small-scale businesses are experimenting around cryptocurrencies. So especially for cross-border payments, this is a very efficient way to transfer and wire transactions or payments. And if we look now at the post-Brexit period, taxation is one of the main problems. So if a solution can be found there, this can also be implemented for cross-border trade systems with in place with other countries. So it's really not only the platform eBay that would profit from this. So on this slide, you can see the thematic syllabus, and we'll first talk about the rationale of jurisdictions, then about technological solutions, and lastly about the combination of both approaches to the VAT fraud detection in cross-border payments. So European member states have some of the highest VAT gaps, amounting to 164 billion euros. And if we look back into the first graph on the availability of a proper crypto asset classification, we can clearly tell that even some member states do not have concrete guidelines in place. And this is in a sense precautious, because especially in a time of economical recession, firm approaches are desperately needed. So if we look now at the ECJ's rationale, we can tell that the VAT legislation makes a distinction between the supply of goods in Article 14, number 1, and then the supply of services. And the first is the right to dispose of tangible property as an owner. Problematically, the ECJ rules concerning the interpretation of Article 9 of the EEC Treaty in the decision Commission versus Italy that the term goods covers all products that can be valued in money and then form a commercial transaction, and this is including tangible non-physical assets as well. In the Skatteverket versus Headquist decision, the ECJ was effectively asked to determine the scope of exemption enshrined in Article 2, number 1 of the EU directive, and this VAT directive read together with Article 135, number 1D determines that virtual currencies are comparable to fiat currencies and thus VAT deductible. And this is essential to cross-border payments, as we've already discussed. And secondly, these technological solutions are also quite interesting because external data is fed into the system through oracles, and those oracles provide the necessary information and connect smart contracts to traditional payment systems. Problematically, even personal data can be wiped into the system, and we will talk about later about the stage on which, the stage of this data intrusion or intrusive behavior. And now we have to classify the common categories of crypto assets and their overlapping spectrum of maturity over time. And the taxation of crypto assets is difficult because cryptocurrencies have more features than solely cash or financial assets. We have, generally speaking, three different categories. Firstly, payment tokens, secondly, utility tokens, and lastly, security tokens. Payment tokens are virtual currencies, and they represent an asset for exchange of goods and services, and at the same time, they store value. Therefore, they have this inherent hybrid function, then or inherently possess of a hybrid function. Then utility tokens are digital tokens that provide users with access to a product or service, and such can be, among those are the storage tokens that provides a bright access to peer-to-peer networks, and ultimately security tokens are traded as an asset and held for value storage purposes as well. Then the value is derived from the success of the entity. And then according to the conceptual framework we find in the International Financial Reporting Interpretation standards, are classified in two different categories. First of all, intangible assets under the EAS 38, and then inventory under the EAS 2. And intangible assets are items identifiable as non-monetary assets without physical substance. Furthermore, economic benefits will float into this entity, and then the holder has the intention to sell the asset. And hence the useful life cycle is not determined by the intention to sell, but to the characteristics of the asset. And software, for instance, has a very short useful life, but non-fundable art tokens have an almost infinite useful life cycle, because once you hold the ULR code, the value that could potentially be added to your piece of art is actually increasing over time. So ultimately, virtual currencies do, with all these different features, meet the definition of an intangible asset under the EIS 38. And according to the EIS 2, inventories are further defined in the EIS 2.3b for cryptocurrency dealers, and this should measure fair value with changes recognized in profit and loss. So once the loss is significantly above the initial benchmark, the asset can unproblematically classify as inventory, and those are held for sale in the ordinary course of business, and the management has the right to keep books and records on the accounting course for holdings of the business, and the judgments may have to be disclosed if the amount recognized in the financial statement is, quote, of significance, in comparison of documents previously issued. Sorry, I meant in the light of. So when it comes to electronic on-chain sustainability, upgrading computing power for transaction from proof of work to proof of stake is essential. And mining is the most energy consuming process on the chain, and miners construct new blocks simultaneously, meaning that the main miner who found the fastest solution and solves puzzle gets the reward first. Although the other miners might have, metaphorically speaking, also found, let's say, gold on the ground, the process of building blocks every transaction just leads to the fact that gold or energy is left behind as waste. And additionally, hackers can trace their way back into these puzzles the miners left while trying to be the first in a row. And for the sake of the energetic sustainability, it is recommendable to shift towards a proof of stake protocol, and the Byzantine tolerance default method votes blocks up and down before construction, and therefore no dead block is left behind, and it's also quite impossible to um, sneak into the system on the head of those dead blocks. And so in case of grave security concerns, every 9 blocks the proof of work protocol can construct the next block. And finance is quite crucial to the understanding of policies in social, economic, and cultural projects. And in the recent years, investors followed the environmental awareness trend, the hedonistic milieu set, so meaning the incentives to engage in self-sufficient renewable energy strategies can be addressed by both, let's say, top-down and bottom-up approaches. So nowadays, most households can afford solar grids on their rooftops, and even small enterprises, wind trees and water treatment plants are expensive. But the major point here is what can be done to facilitate small and big scale investment in green bonds. And although tax equity in the mezzanine investment investment instruments is often used in the renewable energy sector, tax investors must have sufficient tax liability to absorb the tax benefits, and mezzanine investors need to be protected from the volatility of cash flows and subsequent revenue risks. And lately, the European Investment Bank funded a mezzanine debt tranche and will provide a long-term irrevocable letter of credit to this project, which will essentially be beneficial for the trustees of senior bonds, assigned to the senior bonds. Furthermore, balance sheet equity investors mostly look into the internal rate of return or the return on equity, and that of project financing is not a direct obligation for investors, meaning the deal can be supported by a debt to equity ratio, and increasingly green bonds suffer, according to the Harvard Business Review, from an only 2.4% increase in long-term value, as investors prefer short-term value. And when it comes to the more concrete technological solutions, the Oracle Enterprise Taxation Management for VATs is common, but it can only manage audit, investigations, and appeals, and the possibility of using personalized pager ranks, those that are primarily used by Google, do facilitate the finding of outlines and anomalies, and they are quite appealing for many companies. Controversially, it's not personal data that will help to develop this three-tiered queries that can elaborate the data network and the operating persistent schemes. And the Oracle protocol token generally sets the triggers and rebalance based on the stored links, the daily price for the given goods, and the chain link nodes, those who provide real-world data to the smart contracts, can even provide information into various financial systems, and the chain link fetches data from the aggregating endpoints, those who maintain this specific data for, let's say, Oracle's APIs, and only in the third step, the OSM is actually directly interfacing with the proxy contract before pre-selecting the unencrypted personalized data that is only read out in the latest round of data verification. So in the last Supreme Court decision on the copyrightability of APIs, it was the case Oracle versus Google. It was quite clear that Google had incentives of disposing Oracle's APIs, and we could ask ourselves if this has anything to do with the pager ranks, as well. Coming back to the APIs, those are used to deadlock credentials that work through other data points, such as, and then Google comes back, the interoperability interfaces Android currently uses. So when it comes to the data collateral, I ideally recommend you the slightly cynical movie of named Dr. Strangelove. It's about a German scientist who migrated to the United States and became a top agent to the War Cabinet during the Cold War missile crisis. So the main takeaways are that Oracle can be linked to personal data but at the same time, detecting the middleman through identification nodes is quite efficient. When it comes to data security, the Gulf Cooperation Council issued VAT coins that function quite differently, and they are essentially used for the adaptation to their crypto tax strategy, and VAT coins are cryptocurrencies, so no CBDC, and the VAT coin energy bill is positive because the system is based on a mixed consensus protocol. Business have to purchase these VAT coins before wiring cross-border payments, so there's clearly no personal data involved, and the coins are minted centrally. Then payments are automatically embedded in smart contracts along the chain. And in the example on the right, you can see that the amount of money transferred to in the cement trade between Japan, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates is not only traceable but also secure in terms of the protection of personal data, and subsequently the transaction won't keep processing if negative VAT is due. One might argue, yes, but personal data can be shielded. Going back to the slides through this OSMs, but at the same time, they are already in the system, and it's not as if we are under absolute or in absolute control of, let's say, convolutional networks and black boxes. Lastly, the Gulf Cooperation Council might even consider to combine these VAT coins for cryptocurrencies with the ABA project for CBDC, cross-border wholesale payments. Sadly, Turkey decided only recently to ban cryptocurrencies, and this is downhearting as the country could miss out and draw itself apart from the crypto-friendly approaches from one of its largest trading volume partners, the UAE, and that's a lot that can be done legally. Likewise, the EAC region, except Burundi, is ahead of sub-Saharan Africa in terms of the influence for mobile money by virtue of Kenya's engagement